It began as little more than a footnote in the German logistics ledger. Luftgerät 42, an illumination signal device meant to fire colored flares for field communications. Soldiers joked about it. Officers ignored it. Armorers treated it as a nuisance, yet another object to maintain in a war where real weapons, rifles, machine guns, mortars, demanded their attention. Even frontline infantrymen tossed the small launchers into their packs without thinking twice. War was chaos, signals failed, flares were unreliable. Few imagined the device would ever matter. But the Eastern Front had a way of reinventing purpose. The device itself was simple: a steel tube, small trigger mechanism, a chamber for a short, fat cartridge filled with magnesium and phosphorus compounds. It was meant to burn bright in the night sky, broadcasting colors to help coordinate attacks. Red for artillery, white for withdrawal, green for infantry advance. Its official classification was non-lethal. It wasn't designed to kill anyone. A flare was supposed to arc harmlessly upward and illuminate the battlefield. Yet soldiers on both sides quickly discovered that the front did not care about design intentions. It cared about improvisation. As winter tightened over the steppes in 1943, German squads found themselves increasingly isolated. Communications lines were cut daily. Radios froze, batteries died, wires snapped. Flares became one of the only reliable methods of signaling across open, wind-scoured plains. But in the brutal close-quarters engagements that defined village fighting, bunker clearing, and trench assaults, a flare tube could also become something else entirely: a point-blank incendiary weapon. It started accidentally. A German grenadier, cornered by Soviet scouts in a burned-out farmhouse, fired a white phosphorescent signal cartridge horizontally instead of vertically. The flare struck the lead scout in the chest. Instead of bouncing harmlessly, it erupted into a storm of burning fragments, spraying molten phosphorus across the cramped hallway. The blast radius, just under 30 meters, filled the structure with choking white smoke and droplets of fire that clung to uniforms, skin, and wood alike. Within seconds, 3 Soviets were incapacitated. Within 10, the entire patrol had retreated. Word spread within the regiment: the signal device could kill. Not efficiently, not reliably, and not without terrible risk to the user, but in desperation soldiers adopted whatever worked. Soon men began carrying extra signal cartridges. They learned angles, timings, and the unpredictable spread of burning chemicals. Officers tried to halt the practice, citing regulations and the device's non-combat classification. But the Eastern Front had little patience for bureaucracy. A tool that kept a man alive, however crude, became a weapon by default. And so the useless signal device earned its macabre reputation. In the right hands, fired at the right moment, it could turn a narrow corridor or trench into a blinding inferno, lethal within 30 meters. The village of Korovetsk lay half buried in February snow when the 2nd Battalion of the 212th Infantry Division received orders to hold it, at all costs. That phrase had lost meaning by 1943. Everything was to be held at all costs, even when the cost was obvious: freezing nights, ammunition shortages, and a Soviet army whose numbers seemed to multiply with every assault. The German platoons dug in among the shattered wooden houses. Windows were boarded. Doors were reinforced with scavenged beams. Fields of fire were mapped in hurried lines across soot-stained walls. But it was the narrow lanes between the barns and fences that terrified the men most. The Soviets approached like ghosts, using the blowing snow as perfect cover. Gefreiter Lucas Meinhardt was among those ordered to defend the Eastern Road. He carried his Karabiner 98K, 2 grenades, and, strangely, 4 signal cartridges. His friend Adler mocked him for it. "You plan to send them a greeting? Ask them to stop shooting, perhaps?" Lucas only shrugged. "It's what I have left." The attack began before dawn. Red flares, Soviet artillery markers, burst overhead, casting blood-colored light across the snow. Shells slammed into the frozen ground, sending white geysers skyward. Then came the infantry, shapes moving low, fast, purposeful. The Germans returned fire, but the Soviets pressed on, closing the distance with terrifying momentum. When a breach opened near the Eastern Road, Lucas' squad fell back into a barn. The roof had collapsed the week before, leaving only a skeletal frame and a heap of dried hay. Snow sifted through the rafters like ash. The Soviets charged through the broken door in a wave. Lucas fired twice, missed the second shot entirely. His hands shook as he reached for another cartridge, but his rifle jammed halfway through the cycle. The Soviets were already within 10 meters. Desperation decided for him. He dropped the rifle, pulled the signal launcher from his belt, and rammed a cartridge inside. The world narrowed into a single moment. The triggers clicked, the instant hiss, the eruption of white light that turned the entire barn into a burning sun. The flare burst in midair, spraying molten phosphorus in a wild, unpredictable arc. The Soviets screamed as the incendiary shower clung to their padded coats. Flames danced across the hay, catching instantly. The heat was overwhelming, the smoke stung like acid. Lucas stumbled backward, blinded, choking but alive. When the snow settled hours later, the barn was gone, reduced to charred timber and blackened earth. The Soviet advance had been delayed long enough for reinforcements to arrive. And the story of Lucas' desperate shots spread through the battalion. The signal device could stop an assault, could neutralize attackers, could buy crucial seconds in a fight where seconds meant survival. It was no longer a joke. No longer useless. It had become a weapon of fire in a world of snow. The German ordnance engineers had never intended the device to be used this way. In the safe, heated workshops of Berlin and Leipzig, they envisioned orderly battlefields, clear skies, and predictable distances. But the Eastern Front was none of those things. Reports trickled back from field officers describing close-quarters defensive use, irregular deployment, and even deliberate point-blank ignition. Most engineers dismissed such accounts as exaggeration, until enough arrived to form a pattern. Dr. Heinrich Voigt, the lead designer, was summoned to evaluate whether the signal device posed risks to its own users. He traveled to Warsaw, where a demonstration had been arranged at a training ground on the outskirts of the city. Winter winds whipped across the open field. Soldiers gathered in a half-circle, expecting a dull briefing. Instead, they watched Voigt load a cartridge into the launcher, turn to the nearest snowbank, and instruct the men to stand back. "There have been events," he said carefully. "Unintended lethality." He fired. The flare struck the snowbank at an angle, detonating with a violent burst. Burning fragments scattered across 30 meters, hissing and burrowing into the snow like living creatures. The soldiers murmured, startled. Some stepped back instinctively. "This," Voigt continued, "is why regulations prohibit firing at anything other than the sky." Yet when pressed, the infantrymen admitted, sometimes sheepishly, sometimes proudly, that they had used it precisely as a weapon. They described ambushes in trenches, the flare's blinding effect, the terrifying scream of burning phosphorus. One corporal summarized it bluntly, "It is the one thing they do not expect." Voigt felt a chill deeper than the winter air. Improvised weapons were the language of desperation. It meant the front was collapsing in ways no report fully conveyed. But Berlin refused to adapt doctrine. They feared that formally acknowledging the device's lethality would complicate regulations, supply classifications, and international law. So the engineers' warning remained buried in paperwork. Meanwhile, on the front, the signal device continued its unofficial transformation, from a flare launcher into a 30-meter sphere of chaos. To Soviet infantrymen, the German signal device became a specter, unpredictable, silent until the moment of detonation, and horrifying in its effect. Survivors rarely saw the weapon itself. They only saw the burst of light, the sudden blindness, the searing pain as burning chemicals embedded into clothing. Reports circulated among Soviet units of a German firebomb pistol. Some believed it was a new engineered weapon. Others thought it was a violation of accepted wartime conduct. But the front was far too vast and information far too fragmented for any consensus. Soldiers simply adapted. In dugouts outside Kursk, Red Army sergeants instructed recruits to recognize the telltale hiss of an incoming flare fired horizontally. They practiced ducking behind makeshift shields, wooden doors, metal plates, even the corpses of shattered carts. In close quarters fighting, they charged with added caution, scanning German hands not only for rifles and grenades but for small tubular devices clipped to belts. Yet no amount of discipline could fully counteract the chaos created by the incendiary blast. White phosphorus was a cruel enemy. It clung to skin even when snow was packed onto wounds. It continued burning until deprived of oxygen. Many casualties arrived at field hospitals with injuries unlike anything surgeons expected. Irregular burns, chemical scarring, and clothes melted into flesh. Officers filed complaints to headquarters, demanding clarity. Was this a sanctioned German weapon? A fluke? A trick? But the Soviet command, overwhelmed by larger strategic concerns, offered little guidance. The device was acknowledged only as an incendiary hazard, improvised in nature. Still, the stories persisted. A squad trapped inside a wooden stable, burned alive before they could escape. A platoon blinded temporarily during a night assault, left vulnerable to machine gun fire. A sniper whose camouflaged nest caught fire despite being covered in thick snow. The fear became psychological. Even hearing a German reach for something could trigger panic in the tight corridors of ruined buildings. Thus, the device's lethality extended beyond its physical radius. Its true power lay in unpredictability, the sense that even a non-weapon could end a life. And as Soviet forces pushed deeper into contested villages, they carried with them the lingering dread of a flare that did not rise into the sky, but instead descended upon them like a burning storm. By 1944, the signal device had cemented its grim reputation across both armies. It remained a paradox, a tool never meant to kill, yet capable of doing so within 30 meters when misused, or used intentionally, under extreme conditions. It was a reminder that war devoured not only men but meanings. Objects gained new identities. Tools became threats. Even the simplest device could reshape survival strategies. In the final months of the conflict, as German forces retreated westward, soldiers carried fewer cartridges. Supply chains collapsed. Ammunition of any kind became precious. But those who still possessed the signal device kept it close. Not for signaling commanders who no longer existed, but for the chance that it might buy one more moment of life against advancing Soviet formations. In April, near the outskirts of Berlin, Lucas Meinhardt, the same grenadier who had survived the barn in Korovetsk, found himself defending a crumbling apartment block. Artillery thundered across the city. Smoke choked the horizon. Civilians ran between ruins like shadows. Inside a stairwell lit only by cracks in the shattered walls, Lucas waited with 2 remaining cartridges. His rifle was damaged, its bolt worn to uselessness. He felt older than his 21 years. When Soviet troops breached the lower floor, he heard the pounding of boots, the shouts in Russian, the tense rhythm of urban combat. He could have run. Instead he stayed, the small launcher clutched in both hands. He did not want to use it again. He remembered the barn. The screams. The smell. But war did not care what men wanted. As the Soviets ascended the dark stairwell, Lucas fired the first cartridge downward. The explosion lit the entire staircase in blinding white. Soldiers stumbled, slipped, retreated. The smoke curled upward like a living creature, forcing him to cough violently. He loaded the second cartridge with trembling fingers. He knew there would be no third. When he fired again, the blast illuminated his final moment. A narrow corridor, broken plaster falling like snow, and the uncertain faces of young men fighting a war neither side had chosen. The fire burned out quickly. The battle moved past the building. When the Soviets finally entered the stairwell, they found Lucas lying against the wall, the empty launcher beside him. He had not survived. But neither had they forgotten. In diaries, reports, whispered recollections, the device appeared again and again, a symbol of improvisation, fear, and the strange, terrible ways war transformed the mundane into the deadly. A flare meant to signal allies could, under the right, or wrong, conditions, kill an enemy 30 meters away. A weapon by accident. A legacy shaped by desperation. And a reminder that in war, even the smallest spark can become a fire.